Hello, good evening and welcome to another program of Law and Order. Now we all know about space and we know about governments and countries and the world itself trying to explore space from the 60s or 50s, and it's still going on. The projects of NASA or European Space Agency, and now it's going into other countries. But have you ever thought about whether there's a special law governing outer space? Probably not. So today we are going to touch upon this area of law, which is a rare area and a rare specialization by a lawyer. Today, though, I have a lawyer who has specialized in this area of law. He is not a stranger to our studios. Dr. Dan Malika is my guest. Dan Malika is a specialist in outer space law, as well as a specialist in other areas of law, maritime and others, and we had chats on that. So Dan, thank you for coming for this program once again. And how are you today?
Good evening, Chanakya. It's nice to be here back again and feel fine.
Right. Outer space law, because if I had said space law, like you said, people would have wondered, is it a law about spaces? What is outer space law in short?
Yes, it's a very good question, Chanakya. And as you mentioned that you thought of speaking with me on this area, it's actually because of the opportunity that I got to study on this special area during my master's degree in international law, that I did space law as a subject in the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. And you know, in our part of the world, especially in the Asian region, this particular subject has not gathered that much of a momentum and interest. But if you are in US or in Europe, as you very correctly mentioned, the work of NASA and the work of ESA, the European Space Agency, prompt you to think of this specialized area of the law. So coming back to what you asked me, what is outer space law or what is space law? Generally, we know that land has a law. Then sea has a law, but also air has a law. The airlines have to go through the particular legal regime that applies to the airspace. But beyond that, what's the law, or is there a law that we need? Of course, because you know, when you take the airspace can be divided into two areas. The area that comes under the legal regime of air law, which extends to say a maximum of 90 kilometers. Actually, there is no legal definition as to the exact height of the law's application of the airspace. But generally, there is a tendency to regard this as 90 kilometers, and beyond that what exists is, you know, outer space or the space. So in this particular outer space, which is a part of the airspace, there exists a law, but however it is not a national law of a country, but an international law that has been negotiated and entered between the nations, especially in the United Nations.
Right.
So what is space law, or what is outer space law, is the law that relates, or the law that applies to this particular airspace. But however, we need to know that those activities in the outer space do affect the land areas, and therefore knowing the outer space laws are very important.
Okay. So you said there's a United Nations, some kind of a negotiated law. Is there like a convention based on this which is signed by countries, or how does it go?
Yes, let me answer your question this way. You know, when we go back to the history, you mentioned in 1950s, 1960s, these discussions came up regarding a better law for the space activities. So in 1960s, President Eisenhower from the United States, he addressed the United Nations organization, the UN, on the importance of having an outer space law, because at that time there was a battle between US and USSR, especially during the Cold War period. Yeah. You know, US was trying to acquire outer space for its weapon and testing matters of nuclear elements and substances, and then on the other hand Russia also did certain activities. So this particular Cold War could not be settled unless both countries come to a kind of agreement on this use of outer space for weapon and other types of nuclear testing. So President Eisenhower addressed this matter, and the United Nations came up with the idea, yes, we need to bring about the laws that apply to outer space. So that prompted the United Nations to start legislating internationally on what we call now the Treaty on Outer Space, which is the main formal umbrella convention or the law that applies internationally, the Outer Space Treaty. And thereafter, they came with certain other treaties and agreements, such as the Moon Agreement, that I wish to talk about later in this discussion.
This treaty, do you know roughly how many countries would have been signatory to it, and are we a signatory to it to Sri Lanka? Is it a necessary that we also, because we don't have outer space activities much, but is it a necessary thing?
Yes, it's a very interesting question, Chanakya, once again, because there are many countries that have signed and ratified this convention, including Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka signed this also in 1968, I guess, so long time back. But unfortunately, Sri Lanka being a dualistic state, that we need to have our own domestic legislation come in line with the internationally ratified convention, but the local legislations have not come yet in this area of outer space, but we are a party of this outer space treaty.
Right. Now, you mentioned about in your answering your first question about what is outer space law, you said this may have a bearing or a relation or affect the laws in the land as well. Where does this connect, or where does the friction start, if I may use the term, and where is the difference marking the law relating to land, that is the land and sea and air space, and outer space law? Where is the dividing line?
Actually, you know that the United Nations have a specialized office for these space activities called the United Nations Office on Outer Space Activities, and that has brought various states into different kinds of agreements relating to these activities. And answering your question, how come the land activities affect the outer space, and how the outer space law applies to the lands? Very good question. This is how it happens. You know that if you take a rocket or a trajectory that goes into space, and it could be nuclear testing, as I mentioned, weapons of mass destruction, all these things originate on land, and then they pass the airspace and then the outer space areas when they are trajected. So in that case, whatever the object that is sent to space, it could be some nuclear weapon, or it could be a rocket, it could be even the International Space Station that is functioning right now on outer space. They all originate on land, and therefore a proper law or laws have to come into being in order to regularize and legalize these matters. But now when I mention about these weapons of mass destruction, this is the ultimate reason why the international community came up with legalizing the outer space activities, because if US and USSR and now North Korean threats coming up, if we allow these kinds of weapons of mass destructions to approach the outer space, this is going to be a disaster. That's the importance of regularizing and legalizing these activities that take place in the space. And also there are other supplementary matters that come up with satellites, using of radio frequencies, and many more, like even the travel tourism, what the Virgin
Space
Galactica is trying to bring up, you know, like a cruise shipping in the maritime sector. There will be someday in the future that we would be able to travel the space.
Right. At what, you know, every law has a particular jurisdiction it applies. At what point these laws relating to outer space starts applying? Is it beyond the Sesimosphere, where the law relating to aviation, air travel is away? And the second question is, to what area does it cover? For example, does it cover, we'll say, a particular country going and doing exploration in Mars and other existing planets, known planets in the universe? What if we find a new planet? Will it apply there? How does it work, the coverage of outer space law?
Yes, that is a very good question, Chanakya, that you posed to me. As I mentioned, everything starts on land. So the registration of objects that are sent to space have to be done on land, first of all. So whatever the object that is sent to space, first you need to register. And for that, if you are a part, there is an international convention on the registration of objects that are sent to space, and under that the different countries who have become parties can maintain their own register nationally, domestically, to register the certain objects that are sent to space. It could be a rocket, it could be a satellite, or it could be whatever the objects that you are sent to space. So you have an international obligation under the United Nations umbrella to register any article that is sent to space to be registered in your own domestic registry, and that to be communicated to the United Nations when you are about to send to the outer space. So that is how then the law starts to apply, and until this space object comes back to Earth, that particular law covers the whole type of the journey that this particular object is going to travel from land up to airspace, then up to outer space and back.
Right. You said it also applies to satellites. Is there any explanation you can give me on that?
Yes,
application?
Because you know, these satellites are also
they do a work, if I may use that, satellites do a work for the Earth, no? They do a work for, I mean, overall they do a work.
That's what I mentioned, Chanakya, that the radio transmission, right, is directly connected with the satellites, and many transmission, not only radio but also this remote sensing. If you have heard of this word remote sensing, which means that from a satellite you can sensor the entire world. You know, you get all the graphics, the 3D. It could be seismic surveys, even the seabed. You can now seismically survey through remote sensing. So all these things come within the purview of outer space law. That the satellites are all governed by the outer space law, and the states that have registered these satellites in their domestic registry have to be liable for whatever the damages or whatever the objections that come up. Especially now, if you take, for example, there could be situations where these radio transmissions collide with each other.
Right.
Like, for example, now Sri Lanka has not yet sent a satellite to the outer space, but other countries that do have sent satellites, you know, the transmission may collide with each other's transmission. So in that case, it's again, you need to solve these matters by the application of the outer space law or the outer space treaty and the other areas. So therefore, these things are there to solve these matters. Now not only this colliding of these transmissions, but also take the space debris. debris is also pollution.
Right.
Right. Likewise, we have pollution on land. There's much pollution at outer space. Right. The debris of the various objects or vehicles and other satellites that appear in the outer space, these are liabilities of states. So the state that has sent such an object to the space are in turn liable for whatever the debris that has been generated out of that. And one more interesting area that I want to touch upon is that the outer space cannot be appropriated by any country.
Right.
You can't have
that is exactly what I was going to ask you.
occupation.
What are the entitlements and liabilities of states and people in outer space?
So
you're answering that now.
I think I covered
you can't own by any country.
No, I think I covered the liability aspect.
Yeah.
So rights in the sense that you can't occupy the outer space.
Right.
What we call in law the res nullius area status. But also there is a doctrine called rex extra commercium. Right? The outer space cannot be acquired by one country. Cannot be occupied by one country. So whoever who travels to outer space and do research in the outer space have to share them among all the states in the world.
Right.
Especially the parties of the Outer Space Treaty.
Right.
So now that is the reason why most of the states have become parties of the outer space, including Sri Lanka, because we are entitled to obtain whatever the results of the scientific research that take place in the outer space. And also I would like to say that now moon, if you take the moon for example, now moon has its own treaty agreement, as I mentioned, among the states, which means that the moon cannot be acquired by any country, but whoever who goes to the moon and extract whatever the things that they want to get for research or conduct research on the moon itself on land needs to share all those information with the rest of the other country member states, because moon is considered the common heritage of mankind. Now this is a very important legal doctrine, common heritage of mankind. That means that whatever is there in the moon have to be commonly and equitably shared between the states and their mankind.
Okay, has such a treaty not been written, treaty or some law written on behalf of other planets like Mars and Saturn and other, because we are exploring Mars, we are not the world. It has not been thought of that way.
Not been thought of that way, because you know that the moon is the closest celestial body to us, to our world Earth. But however, even though there are no separate or specific agreements or conventions regarding Mars or Jupiter or whoever, whatever the planet, right? They are all covered in the Outer Space Treaty that has been signed worldwide, because it speaks about not only the outer space but also the celestial bodies in common, and also the moon. So when you say celestial bodies, it covers all the other celestial bodies like the other planets, as you mentioned. But very interestingly, now think that on Earth at UN, we are regularizing the space activities, and also we are including the other celestial bodies. Now imagine if you find some other aliens in other celestial bodies, there will be a legal conflict how we could legislate for somebody else. So that is an area that in the future we will have to look. But when it comes to the future, I also want to add up here, commercialization of outer space activities are happening very much, and therefore the laws have to be developed in order to maintain this balance and application on the commercial utilization of space activities. Like I said,
how can you do that?
Yeah, exactly.
Because I want to ask you, now you mentioned earlier about the space tourism. I think it is being tested now. Am I correct? Or
yes,
nobody has gone as a space tourist so far.
Exactly, especially the Virgin Atlantic or the Virgin.
But nobody has gone so far. Has anybody gone as a space tourist? No.
Has gone, but to International Space Station they used to take, but it's a kind of not like a tourist in fact, but they have
taken. But you're working on that. Okay.
Yes.
So when you do that, competitive companies will come with competitive business, and there may be space hotels and all that kind of thing. So what is the law thinking, at least internationally, of commercial distribution or equal distribution or commercial utilization of space?
Yeah, that is why I told you, Chanakya, that since the outer space cannot be occupied or appropriated by any country, we need to have some sort of agreement commercially where these kinds of commercial activities could take place, and then the countries to operate these types of space tourism programs. That would, I think, it would come, but may take time. But we need to start the process of creating laws for the commercialization of space activities, and that was really my attempt in my master's thesis, where I concentrated on the law relating to commercial uses of outer space. But also, you know, when it comes to military affairs, as I mentioned, disarming of outer space is also very important, and to make space, outer space, a peaceful place, like in the United Nations Charter, you know, it's mandatory to maintain peace and order also in the
replication of Earth,
in the outer space.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, is there any sort of working done, like a draft paper or draft convention on this, like on the areas that you said about commercial proper utilization of outer space? Not yet.
No, there are certain documents that have been done, especially multilateral agreements, bilateral agreements, but in the United Nations, which is really the custodian of all these activities, nothing has come beyond what I said regarding the commercial users for these conventions and so forth. But several universities are working on that, especially the McGill University in Canada. Then in Netherlands, they have the very famous universities, Leiden, working on these European Space Agency. NASA is working on this, because they are the ones who are into the commercial fields. But also, I would like to say that we have to give gratitude to a Sri Lankan in this, because he headed the United Nations Space Office called Dr. Nandasuri Jasunthiliana, and he's retired now, but he was heading this space legal division of the United Nations, and he did yeoman service in this. So we need to, as Sri Lankans, pay him gratitude for his work with these types of activities, especially with also the commercial activities, commercial legal lawmaking.
Right. What are your final thoughts to people who want to get involved in this area of law? Is there scope for lawyers? Is there scope for people get involved in outer space law, or is it just another academic thoughts at the moment?
No, I won't say that it's an academic thought, because you know that this is an area of the law that is developing. But I don't know during our lifetime whether it would be a reality in this country. But obviously in other countries, this is much in operation. There's a lot of research taking place, a lot of thought-provoking think tanks being created on this. There are a lot of developments, there are a lot of drafts that are coming up, but unfortunately not in Sri Lanka. So I would say, I would advise law students to take up these things as a challenge, because you know, in our legal studies, I always express my opinion that we are still traditionally thinking, you know, we are not thinking out of box. And you know about me that I always wanted to think out of box. I did space law, I did maritime law, which have really benefited me in pursuing. But I want to say to the younger generation, to the next generation, do these kinds of, you know, new vistas, get into new vistas of the legal spectrum and think out of box. These are the futures of especially those who want to aspire in a legal career abroad. These are the areas that you need to think of, you know. And but however, Sri Lanka will need more time. We need experts, of course, in Sri Lanka to make up these areas, but it's a good time, hard time for the government to think of bringing in some white papers and start to develop these in at least draft stage.
Yeah. So the advice from Dr. Dan Malika is for the young lawyers is think out of box. Then you can at least think about out of space law. Dr. Dan Malika, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
on Law and Order today. and we wish you success in whatever you do in the future. That's Law and Order, and we'll for this week we'll catch up with you next week at the same time. You can watch our programs all over again by going into our website channeli.lk and picking Law and Order from the drop down menu. Then you can watch our previous programs once again. My guest was Dr. Dan Malika. We are talking about out of space law. Next week will be another interesting topic, and have a good night and a good weekend.